At 9:02 a.m., the line at Bozeman Town Hall moved slowly until the man in the wool coat stepped to window 4 and handed over an ID card, faded by time. Not use. The heater wheezed again from somewhere behind the vending machine. Posters for Veterans Week lined the lobby wall corners, curling from dry air, but no one looked at them. Not the clerk behind the glass who squinted through his reading glasses at the card in his hand. "This isn't even laminated," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably in his office chair. The man on the other side of the glass said nothing. He wore a dark green wool coat that looked like it had survived a war and several Montana winters. His gloves were tucked into the crook of his elbow. Fingers folded neatly, and in his left hand was a dented steel thermos tucked like an afterthought. The clerk tilted the card toward the light. "There's no barcode, no expiration date, and it says issued 1974. We've updated this system at least 3 times since then." Still the man didn't respond. He kept his gaze level, his shoulders straight, his boots square with the counter. He looked calm, not confused, not even particularly interested. Behind him, the line barely shuffled forward. A woman with a toddler sighed loudly. A man in a Broncos cap muttered something about government moving at the speed of rust. The smell of burnt drip coffee hovered over everything, mixing with old tile and morning cologne. "Name," the clerk asked, finally glancing at the form Caleb had signed in front of the plastic tray. "Caleb Strickland," the old man said, voice low but firm. From a bench near the information desk, Judge Alvin Huxley folded his newspaper with a deliberate flick. He was retired technically, but still presided over community cases and administrative hearings. This morning, he just wanted to get a parking permit validated and move on with his day. Instead, he found his patience thinned by a slow-moving line and an old man holding it up with a document older than most of the staff. The clerk sighed. "Mr. Strickland, I don't think we can process this without a digital record, or at least a modern ID. Do you have a DD-214 or any veteran status confirmation from the last 20 years? Caleb considered this, but only for a breath. "It served its purpose," he said. The clerk blinked. "I'm sorry." "The card," Caleb said. "It served its purpose. That was all it was meant to do." A low chuckle floated in from the bench, Judge. Huxley stood and walked closer, stopping just beside the line, his expression one of polite curiosity, polished by decades of courtroom posture. "If you can't prove who you are," he said, not unkindly, "you're wasting everyone's time." Caleb turned slightly enough to see the man addressing him, but not enough to move his boots from where they stood. "I served," he said quietly. The clerk looked helpless, glancing at his monitor, then at the small crowd gathering behind. A second clerk poked her head from the back room, then quickly retreated. Caleb took his ID back with a nod and stepped to the side without protest, moving toward a wooden bench with the slow deliberation of someone who had walked longer, harder roads than this. At the information counter, Mabel paused in stacking paper pamphlets and looked up. Her father didn't look back at her, but she could feel the weight of him sitting down near the lobby radiator, unscrewing the cap of his thermos with steady fingers. She adjusted the collar of her cardigan and went back to her forms. Judge Huxley, apparently satisfied, returned to his seat, shaking his head faintly and tapping his pen against the corner of his clipboard. He sat with the same stillness he had at the counter, as if gravity applied differently to him than the rest of the room. His knees didn't bounce. He didn't check his watch. He didn't glance at the television in the corner, which was playing a local morning segment on Turkey Drive donations. Instead, Caleb poured a small measure of coffee into the plastic cap lid and took a quiet sip. The scent of bitter black brew rose, mingling with the lingering trace of shoe polish and wool. No one watched. Not really, but one or two older men seated on the edge of a leather-patched bench across the room exchanged a look without speaking. Tom the clerk shuffled papers behind the window and tried to reset the queue number 47. He called. A young mother moved forward with her form half completed, her toddler tugging at her coat. Caleb didn't look at them. He was looking at the floor tiles, or maybe beyond them. Mabel stared blankly at a list of local events. Her fingers hovered over the tape dispenser, motionless. There was a tightness behind her eyes she hadn't admitted even to herself. She had told her father she would help him process the paperwork that morning. He'd declined, said it wouldn't take long. Saeed, the system knew what it needed to know, but of course it didn't. She had known in some quiet part of herself that this would happen, that the town wouldn't recognize his name, that his ID wouldn't scan, that no one would remember who he was. What she hadn't expected was her own reaction. When Judge Huxley leaned forward and said what he did, "Are you sure you didn't just buy that uniform from a surplus bin?" The words had cut through her like they were meant for her. What? Him. She should have spoken up, but instead she'd done what she always did, stayed neutral, quiet, let him carry the weight. A shuffle near the back caused her to glance up. A young man, crew-cut uniform tucked crisp under a bomber jacket, was slowly rising from the bench near the main entrance. His hand still held a half-empty paper cup, but it was tilted, slightly forgotten. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the old man by the radiator. And he wasn't just looking. He was studying. She didn't recognize him, but something in the way his posture shifted, straightening slightly, his narrowing muscles, coiling like memory, was taking physical form, made her heart thud, once heavy and unsteady. Across the lobby, Dylan Reyes, a young man in naval fatigues, turned his head sharply at the name Strickland. Dylan couldn't stop staring, not because the man looked impressive, but because something about the way he stood screamed, "Instructor." He had seen that kind of posture before, shoulders square, chin level, not stiff like parade formality, but fluid, grounded. It was the stance of someone who had spent decades letting their environment tell them everything before they spoke. The old man didn't check the clock. Didn't fidget, just sipped coffee from the dented steel thermos and waited as if the rest of the town had no bearing on his internal clock. Dylan shifted in his seat near the main entrance, barely noticing the hum of the vending machine or the draft that tickled the Veterans Week flyers behind him. The memory came uninvited, sudden and sharp, the way snow howled through a canyon somewhere in Alaska, boots crunching over frozen gravel, and a voice not barked, not shouted, but firm, telling them that survival wasn't about strength, but about silence. He remembered that course well. Cold Peak, no names. Just code names and ice. 3 men lost their footing that week, 2 nearly lost fingers, and one of them nearly lost his life, if not for a man Dylan never saw again. After that final night, older than the other instructors, quiet, sharp-eyed, like he could see through tents and blizzards, both, the only memory Dylan had held on to clearly was that man's hands, leathery, steady, and the way he passed around his thermos after the last field drill. Not to hydrate them, just to show they were still human. Dylan's gaze dropped now across the waiting room to the man's hands, one wrapped around the thermos, the other resting lightly on his knee, and there it was, a small, puckered scar about the size of a coin just beneath the right knuckle. A familiar mark, the same hand that had pressed a map into his chest during their final nav exercise with the words, "Get home, no heroics." The room hadn't changed much. Clerk Tom was still calling numbers in a voice that no one really paid attention to. Someone's phone buzzed briefly, then went silent. The local radio station, drifting through the PA system, now played an old Willie Nelson track, a little too soft to catch lyrics. Mabel stood by the copier near the side hallway, pulling out a jammed form and brushing her bangs back in frustration. She didn't look up. Dylan stood slowly, not rushed, He left his coffee on the bench and walked across the tile heels, making the faintest clicks against the old floor. He stopped a respectful distance from Caleb. "Sir," he said, voice low, not wanting to draw attention. "Did you ever teach Cold Peak survival units?" Caleb didn't lift his gaze at first, just slowly finished his sip and replaced the cap on the thermos. Then he turned his head slightly, meeting Dylan's eyes. Once he said, "Years back, that was all. It was enough." Dylan nodded. His breath caught slightly in his throat, and he didn't try to hide the shift in his face, shock recognition, maybe even shame for not having seen it sooner. He sat down on the bench beside the man, careful not to encroach. A respectful silence settled between them. The vending machine hummed again behind them, dispensing a can of something cheap and fizzy. "No one looked their way. I didn't know your name then," Dylan said after a pause. "They never told us." "They weren't supposed to," Caleb replied, not unkindly. "Some courses were like that." "I remember your boots more than anything," Dylan said. Kept moving through snow like it didn't exist. Caleb didn't answer. But something near his mouth twitched, barely there, almost a smirk that thought better of itself. He adjusted the thermos in his hand. For a brief moment, he turned it toward Dylan, unscrewed the lid again, and without a word passed it across. Dylan froze. Not because it was a strange gesture, but because it wasn't. The weight of the thermos, the plastic lid still faintly stained. It was exactly like that moment in the canyon, the last gesture before they'd all shipped out. He accepted it slowly, hands steady but heart pounding, and took a small sip, burnt bitter, slightly metallic. Just like before, Caleb took it back with the same silent grace and twisted the cap shut. Then, as Dylan watched, he reached inside his coat and drew out something small from a chest pocket. His fingers briefly rolled it between knuckles. Just a glimpse, but enough. A round brass coin, its edges worn, its engraving almost smoothed with time. He didn't hand it over, just held it long enough for Dylan to see it, and then tucked it back into the dark fold of the coat. They sat like that for another minute, before Dylan finally reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. No words. Just a quick scroll, a tap, and a quiet series of keystrokes. Dylan texts his old SEAL unit group chat. "He's here. It's him, Commander Strickland." Judge Huxley taps his clipboard and calls Caleb back to the bench. "Let's settle this," he says loud enough for everyone to hear. The murmur of paperwork, rustling, and muted conversations stalled like a radio losing signal. The fluorescent lights above the community courtroom buzzed softly, a single bulb flickering in protest. Caleb rose from the bench with the same unhurried grace as before. No one in the room spoke, though several leaned slightly forward in their seats. Dylan stayed where he was, near the rear bench, his spine-straight eyes fixed on the table at the front, where Caleb now walked. The old man moved with the careful certainty of someone who no longer mistook speed for progress. As he approached the front table, he paused, reached into his coat, and placed something small and round on the edge of the polished wood. A brass coin, slightly dulled, flattened at the edges from years of passing through pockets and palms. It caught the overhead light just enough for Dylan to recognize it. Caleb sat down with both hands resting on his knees. Eyes forward, posture relaxed, but still unmistakably disciplined. The judge cleared his throat, flipping the page in front of him without looking up. "Mr. Strickland," he began, "your ID was reviewed earlier and deemed non-compliant by administrative standards. If you do in fact claim to have served, especially in any command capacity, I'll need to see official records to verify rank and service." Caleb's gaze didn't flicker. "I was active," he said, "Southeast Asia." The judge raised an eyebrow, steepling his fingers. "You'll forgive me, sir, but that could mean anything. Advisor, contractor, field mechanic. That era, a lot of things got lost in translation." Mabel, standing near the side aisle, flinched almost imperceptibly. The folder in her hands had become a vice grip. She hadn't dared speak earlier, afraid her voice would betray too much guilt, anger, shame, maybe all three. Caleb didn't bristle, didn't flinch. He simply replied. I was with Arctic Recon, Forward Unit, Deep Ops. The judge leaned back. I'll need to see documentation, not just recollection. That's when Dylan stood. He didn't say a word at first, just stepped forward from the rear bench. His boots made a low tap on the wood floor with each step. People turned. One man in the second row straightened his tie unconsciously, permission to speak. Dylan asked, voice low but firm. Judge Huxley looked mildly startled. You are? Petty Officer Dylan Reyes, he said. Naval Special Warfare, Active Reserve. Cold Peak certified. The judge blinked, pen paused mid-note. I trained under a man at Cold Peak 2 years ago, Dylan continued. A man with no name in the file, no introduction. Just a voice in a snowstorm and a hand steady enough to light a fire, with one match and no excuses. The courtroom stilled, even the heating vent behind the bench seemed to quiet. That man is Commander Caleb Strickland, Dylan said. Arctic Recon. He taught us how to survive when the maps ran out. In the corner, Mabel dropped the folder. Dozens of forms spilled across the tile with the sound of a dozen thin slaps, paper against polished floor. Judge Huxley leans forward, stunned. Commander. You could hear the floor creak under boots as the silence wrapped tighter around the courtroom. No one moved. Even the heating unit, that had been humming inconsistently all morning, seemed to pause between clicks, as though waiting for what would come next. The brass coin on the edge of the table glinted beneath the dull overhead fixture. Dylan's eyes lingered on it. He knew exactly what it meant. Arctic Recon didn't issue those as keepsakes. They were earned in silence, handed only when there were no more words left to give. Judge Huxley stood frozen behind the bench, one hand still hovering near the folder. He had just snapped closed. His mouth was slightly open as though something more had been on the verge of spilling out, but the title Commander had lodged itself in his chest like a stone. Are you truly Commander Strickland? He asked, voice thinner now. Less sure, Caleb didn't blink. He looked at the judge with neither defiance nor concession, only patience. Not anymore, he said, but once, yes. The admission carried no triumph. It wasn't a declaration, it was just a fact laid gently on the room like snow beginning to stick against the glass. Dylan reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone and held it up. Not for theatrics, but for truth. These were taken during our winter phase at Cold Peak, he said. Voice steady. That's him, Instructor Zero, no name, no badge. But same scar, same voice. Geotagged to grid, C5 time-stamped, February 14th, 2021. He turned the screen toward the bench. The first photo showed a group of recruits hunched near a campfire, and a shadow in the background, face half obscured, but unmistakable. Another photo captured a rough field drill, a blurred shot of the same man giving hand signals to a trainee crouched behind snowbanks. I remember the tone he used, Dylan added. Low, deliberate. He told us silence wasn't a punishment. It was a discipline. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. But a few people shifted in their seats, hands clasped a little tighter. One man in the third row, silver hair and a flag pin on his collar, gave a near-invisible nod. From the hallway, footsteps echoed. The courtroom doors creaked open, and Linda Harper peeked in. Her apron was still tied around her waist, the name tag of her cafe pinned to her chest. She scanned the room and found Caleb, then stepped through the threshold without being invited. I wasn't going to say anything, she said, voice loud enough to carry. But he taught my brother back in '86. He came home different, said a man. Up north, saved his life, never got his name. I saw a picture once, it was you. Judge Huxley looked as though he'd aged 5 years. In 5 minutes, his shoulders had sagged slightly, the formality in his posture unraveling strand by strand. Mabel's hand trembled slightly as she stepped forward from the side. Her voice cracked before she even finished her first word. He asked me never to tell. Caleb turned, but said nothing. I honored that too long, she said, her eyes brimming but unspilled. I thought silence was what he needed. But maybe it was just what I was used to. Judge Huxley's eyes dropped to the brass coin still resting on the edge of the table. He stared at it for a moment longer, then placed both palms flat on the bench and exhaled. This court doesn't have the tools to verify covert deployments or shadow designations, he said finally. But Mr. Strickland... He paused, voice faltering just slightly. You don't need this court to verify your history, but this court owes you its respect. There was no applause, just the shuffle of feet, the slow rustle of jackets being pulled tighter. Someone in the back cleared his throat. Others bowed their heads slightly, not in mourning, but in recognition. The plaque listing war heroes on the wall behind the judge stood untouched. But for the first time in years, it seemed insufficient, names weathered by decades, none later than 94. There was space beneath them unused, waiting. As the room begins to move again, Dylan hands Caleb a folded piece of paper, something I thought you should see. At the diner that evening, steam rose from black coffee as Dylan slid a manila folder across the table to Caleb. The corner booth at Maple and Iron had deep cushions worn soft by decades of elbows, uniforms, and whispered stories. A yellow-tinted bulb dangled overhead, flickering once before settling into a dim glow. The jukebox in the back played something slow by Waylon Jennings, almost buried beneath the clink of plates and the hush of a gentle snowfall outside the window. Caleb reached for his mug with his left hand, and with the other opened the folder. He didn't look surprised. He just blinked once slowly, then exhaled through his nose. The paper inside had a government seal at the top and a string of blacked-out lines. One paragraph was circled, photocopied from a declassified memo, barely 2 weeks old. Strickland, Caleb, Arctic lead status unrecoverable. No further inquiry. Caleb folded the folder shut after a moment and rested both hands on top of it. I figured you already knew, Dylan said quietly. I did, Caleb answered. But it's something seeing it written down. Linda approached from the side with a pot of coffee and a knowing smile. She didn't ask questions, just topped off both mugs and walked away with a squeeze of Caleb's shoulder. They said we were ghosts, Caleb murmured. No names, no records, the kind of missions that didn't leave footprints. So we left none, and you agreed to that, Dylan asked. We were told no names, Caleb said. We didn't disobey. There was no pride in his voice, just memory worn flat like an old coin. The sugar dispenser sat untouched on the table until Caleb reached for it. He tipped a small pile into his coffee, then left the spoon beside the mug without stirring it. Dylan noticed, but said nothing. The doorbell jingled and Mabel stepped inside, brushing snow from her sleeves. She hesitated near the pie display, adjusting the strap of her purse, then walked slowly to their table. She wore a cardigan Dylan hadn't seen before. Light blue, thick knit, with buttons that looked older than he was. Caleb looked up and saw it, and for a moment said nothing. It's Mom's, Mabel said, sitting down beside Dylan. She would have come too, you know? If she were here, Caleb nodded. I know. They sat in quiet for a beat. Then Dylan reached across and gently pushed the folder toward Mabel. She opened it, read the paragraph, and didn't say anything right away. I used to lie, she finally said. When I was a kid. Told the other girls my dad had medals, that he was in parades, that he got saluted at the airport. Caleb didn't flinch, he just waited. I hated that. I didn't have anything to show. She continued. All the other dads had plaques, flags in display boxes. You had a thermos. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then quietly. Silence was never meant to shame, just to protect. Mabel swallowed hard. Her fingers rested on the folded edge of the memo, then slowly moved across the table toward her father's. She placed her hand on his gently. Well, she said, maybe now's the time to let people remember. Caleb turned his palm up to meet hers, gave it the faintest squeeze, and reached into his coat pocket. The coin reappeared, dull brass, warm from his body heat. He slid it across the formica tabletop, slow and deliberate, until it rested before Dylan. Dylan didn't reach for it right away, his gaze locked on it like it might vanish if he blinked. The edges were worn, the engraving softened, but the insignia was still there, Arctic Recon etched around a snow-capped peak. He picked it up, slowly, says, "So what now?" Caleb replies, "Now you carry it?" The next morning, just past 7 a.m., Lane 3, at Bozeman's Veterans Wall, had a new brass plate bolted in place. It was no larger than a business card. The screws weren't even flush yet, one of them still needed tightening, but the engraving had already begun to catch the light through the front windows. Thin winter sunlight poured through as the double doors creaked open and Caleb Strickland stepped inside. He wore the same wool coat, buttoned all the way, collar turned up just enough to meet the base of his neck. His thermos hung at his side, like always, gripped low in his right hand. He didn't pause to stamp snow off his boots or glance around the lobby. He just walked his usual path toward the wood-paneled hallway where the Veterans Wall stood, in quiet dignity along the east-facing corridor. Dylan was already there. Not in uniform this time, just boots, jeans, a dark coat, and a knit cap pushed back slightly on his head. In his hands was a small cardboard box, military surplus green tape. He didn't say anything, just turned and nodded once when Caleb approached. Caleb's eyes moved to the plaque. He didn't reach out to touch it, didn't kneel or take off his hat. He simply stood there, reading the 6 engraved words in silence. Reserved. Commander Caleb Strickland. Ret. Arctic Recon. Until he says otherwise. A couple of town employees passed quietly behind them, whispering not out of fear, but in respect. One of them offered a faint nod, and Caleb returned it with nothing more than a lift of the chin. Mabel stood just around the corner, pretending to review a clipboard, though her eyes never left her father. She didn't interrupt. She wouldn't. Dylan cleared his throat softly and stepped forward, holding out the box. Didn't figure it'd be right showing up empty-handed, he said. 45 rounds. Fresh batch, full brass. Caleb took the box slowly, weighed it in one hand, then looked at the label without opening it. His mouth twitched, that almost smile again. Next time, Dylan added, "Bring more than 30. They walked toward the wooden bench beneath the Veterans Wall, the one that always creaked when you leaned too far left. They sat without speaking, and after a moment, Caleb unscrewed the thermos cap and poured a little into each lid, 2 identical plastic cups, one older than the other. The coffee was black, strong, still hot. They drank together, not facing each other, just watching the frost settle outside. For a long time, neither said a word. People came and went. The wall clock ticked softly. Somewhere in the distance, the city plow passed by, throwing snow to one side of the street. You ever wonder why the quiet ones remember more? Caleb finally said, his voice low. Dylan smiled. Because they saw more than we ever asked. Caleb didn't answer, but his eyes lingered on the young man beside him. The kind who still had questions, still carried too much weight behind the ribs. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the coin, the same brass disc that had passed through frozen tents and paperless orders through decades of silence, and held it out again. Caleb places the coin back in Dylan's hand. Now it's yours to pass on in a quiet town hall. A A simple brass plaque said more than any ceremony could. No speeches were given, no parades marched, but respect settled into the room like snow on an empty bench. Sometimes the truest strength doesn't announce itself. It waits steady and silent until someone chooses to see beyond the surface, like a lantern in a winter window. Quiet kindness can light the way long after the flame has gone. And if this story stirred something in you, perhaps there's someone near you, a neighbor, a stranger carrying more than they show, let them know you see them.